I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house and welcome to day 2 of my Amityville Horror read-along book marathon. Really should have come up with a name for this feature, but we're on book 2, The Amityville Horror Part 2 by John G. Jones. John G. Jones takes over the mantle from Jay Anson and really does mine this Amityville scene for all it's worth. We're going to have a few John G. Jones books now. And The Amityville Horror Part 2 follows the Lutz family after they flee the house at 112 Ocean Avenue because the horror follows them. And that's what this continuing story is all about. I got on a lot more with this, with some reservations, which I'll dig into. Talking about Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror, I didn't really mesh with the style, the sort of reportage, which turned into more of a list of things happening to try and give, I guess, the notion of verisimilitude. Jones has let himself off the hook with his Amityville Horror books. As he explains in the foreword, Amityville 2 is written in a narrative, novelistic style in an attempt to communicate not only the facts, but the feelings behind the facts. Those feelings, after all, are the tools that the forces at Amityville use to torment the Lutzes and their friends. They are the weapons that caused an innocent family to abandon their home and irrevocably changed their lives forever. What it also allows John G. Jones to do is say, not all of this actually happened, but this is what it felt like when you're under the threat of the Amityville Horror. So it does read a lot more like a novel. There is a lot more internal thoughts and feelings of George and Kathy Lutz and other characters around them. It makes it a damn sight easier to read. This is a bit of a doorstep, and I was a little bit daunted at first. Luckily, the font is pretty large, and Jones is really quite free and easy with his paragraphs. You'll quite often get a run of paragraphs that are just maybe 4 or 5 lines long. You can really buzz through this. You can probably buzz through it because it's a mite inconsequential. Unless you really buy into wholesale the story of George and Kathy Lutz, this is kind of like a little bit more of the same, but less so. Weirdly, for a book that lets itself off the hook narratively to go into wild and crazy places, the hauntings, the supernatural attacks on the Lutzes are slightly more down to earth in this. Some of the more extra stuff, if we shall call it, happens in nightmares. A lot of the more widescreen supernatural weirdness happens in nightmares. So Jones isn't trying to sell you on some of the absolute craziness that Jay Anson tries to sell you on. One of the things I really enjoyed about the myth of the original Amityville Horror was that the horror, if you like, doesn't end at the doorstep. It can reach out beyond the house and get you if you've stepped across the threshold, or if you become enmeshed in trying to help the Lutzes. The evil will reach out from the house and swat you like it does with Father Mancuso. In that way, it's kind of Ju-on the Grudge and the Ju-on Curse in those films are kind of similar, adept to the Amityville Horror. You don't have to be inside the house to experience the hauntings. That concept, as much as I like it, is stretched a little thin in this book, where the Lutzes are the stars. Because really and truly, the house is the star. There's a little scene in this where a TV crew and some psychic investigators go into the house and they get attacked. And it was really nice to be back inside the house again and have that brief sort of cameo from the house, because it's an Amityville story. You kind of want the house, you kind of need the house. The children's names are changed. I'm not sure what that is about. I don't know which book has the right children's names, and honestly, I don't want to go digging to find out, but it's things like that and details of the final night changing from the first book to the second book that start to maybe show the cracks in the story for a doubting Thomas like me. There also seems to be a little bit of score settling with the Lutzes in conjunction with Jones in this. Jay Anson appears briefly in the sequel book, and there seems to be a little bit of shade thrown on Mr. Anson, and the movie of the Amityville Horror comes out during the period that this book is set in, and there seems also to be maybe a little bit of grudge settling and score settling with the makers of the film. Not lots, not tub thumping, not evangelizing or anything like that, but just a little bit of score settling, just a little light counterpunch here and there, some gripes. So we really mainly follow George, and sometimes he's accompanied by Kathy on the book selling tour, and they're doing the rounds of the chat shows and the like. Go over to Amsterdam, and then it kind of just ends with a very surprising exorcism that just kind of happens, and then the book ends. So in that way, it's not really structured like a traditional novel. I get the very strong feeling that it ended because it had to end there with a sort of fake denouement so that the rest of the story could be told in the inevitable Amityville Horror 3, the final chapter. These two do go up really to make one complete tale of what happens to the Lutzes once they left the house in Amityville. I also picked up there's a scene where George is very insistent with his lawyer that they want to cut all ties, even at a financial loss, with the house, and orders him to have an auction of all of the contents of the house, and he's very insistent, and it raised a wry chuckle because later on in the series, once Jones has completely unhooked himself from the pretense of telling a true story, he mines the house auction for all it's worth, and why not? So really what you have here is 2/3 of an act, and the next book, the final chapter, is, and horror fans always smile when we hear something called the final chapter, don't we? The final chapter really is the third act. That's why it's a lot slimmer, the third act of the whole story, and we'll talk about Amityville Horror 3, the final chapter, tomorrow in the next video.